Alright, hey everyone. Today we're reading chapter 12 of Banner in the Sky by James Ramsey Ullman. Alright, chapter 12 A Boy and a Ghost. The beat, er, oop, the first blast of wind struck him as he made for the top of the cleft. It battered against his body and ripped at his clothing, and he had to cling to a projecting crag to keep from being flung from the mountainside. In the short lull that followed, however, he was able to lower himself into the cleft, and there he had some protection. The wind rose again, screaming through the upper air and moaning in the hollows of the rock, but only gusts and eddies penetrated the deep crack in the wall, and he was able to keep his hand and footholds. In half the time it had taken him to go up, he worked his way down the narrow ledge at its bottom. Here he was again exposed to the gale, but fortunately it was blowing straight in against the mountainside, pinning him to it rather than pushing him away, and he was able to get across the bulge in the precipice with rather less difficulty than he had had before. That, however, was the end of his good luck. As he came around the curving shelf to the platform at the base of the fortress, the storm struck him crosswise with such force that he had to throw himself flat on the rocks. And now it was not only the wind that it hurled at him, but snow as well. On his hands and knees he crept forward and stopped. Somewhere ahead of him the platform ended and fell away into the long spine of the ridge, but where that somewhere was he could not tell. All he could tell All he could see were the rocks directly in front of him, and beyond the rocks the driving snow. Each time he moved, it might be toward the ridge, or toward the 2,000-foot precipice of the south and east faces. He peered up into the gray churning of the sky, then lowering his head he covered it with his arms and waited. But minute by minute the storm grew in intensity, and when he looked up again the snow lashed into his eyes in blinding horizontal waves. The voice of the wind rose from a moan to a wail, from a wail to a high insane shrieking, and then through the shrieking there was another sound, a deep rumbling sound, high above that brought Rudy half to his feet in sudden terror. It was a rockfall, he thought, here in this exact spot 15 years ago, before the fateful avalanche of boulders had roared down upon his father and his companions. And now the same thing was happening to him. He struggled to his feet, only to be knocked flat again by the wind. He looked about desperately for some sort of shelter, but there was only the blinding snow, streaming like white needles into his eyes. In a moment now the hail of rocks would be upon him. He waited, crouched and tense, but the rumbling was gone, and now he realized it was not a rockfall he had heard, but thunder. In the next instant a fork of lightning split the sky, flooding the mountainside with a wild greenish glare. And the thunder rolled again, louder. No, this time the rocks had fallen, but that did not mean he was safe from them. Any moment the lightning might strike on a crag above and send its splintered fragments plunging down, or worse yet, might hit directly at the exposed ledge on which he was trapped. Again, crawling on hands and knees, Rudy worked his way in toward the wall of the fortress. Groping along its base, he searched for some sort of shelter. At last he found it, a hollowed-out section of rock, with its sides and top projecting outward so that they formed in effect a small shallow cave. He crept into it, wedged himself back in the farthest corner, and murmured a brief prayer of thanksgiving. For here he was protected not only from falling rock and lightning, but also from the full fury of the wind. He wiped the caked snow from his eyes and nose. He beat his chilled hands together. He waited. How long the storm continued, he did not know. On that battered mountainside, time had ceased to exist, and there was only the storm, now the wind and snow, the thunder and lightning, the wild roar of sound that grew and grew until it seemed to come no longer from the churning air, but from the deep roots of the mountain itself. If any stones fell on the platform before him, he could neither see nor hear them. On three sides his world was bounded by black walls of rock, on the fourth by an opaque screen of streaming white. The wind slackened slightly, and he waited. It rose, and he waited, again and then once more it slackened, but this time did not rise, and he knew that at last the storm was blowing itself out. Minute by minute the shrieking faded, the snow no longer blew in horizontal waves, but fell in a long slant, and then straight down, and then not at all. Far in the distance the wind still moaned across crags and ice fields, but the high flanks of the citadel there was no sound or movement. The peak stood up, vast and white-mantled, frozen in silence and space, but still Rudy sat motionless. The passing of the storm brought no shout to his lips or lift to his heart, for now, suddenly, he was aware of something he had forgotten during the hours past. Time had not ceased to exist. The sun had not stopped in its course. It had moved on above the tempest steadily, inexorably, until now only its last light was gleaming above the white ranges to the west. The storm was gone, yes, but in its place was oncoming night. Creeping from the cave, he got to his feet and crossed to the outer edge of the platform and looked down. The ridge, now snow-covered, slanted away into gray dusk, and even as he watched he could see the shadows thickening as they flowed up over it from the gulfs below. The snow slope at the bottom showed merely as a faint white gleaming. The icefall and glaciers still farther down were altogether hidden in darkness. Oh, oh my goodness. I'm tired today. Sudden panic seized him. He had to get down. He thought wildly. He had to get down or die. Lowering himself from the platform, he tried to follow the ridge. His eyes searched for invisible holds, and his feet slipped and stumbled on the snow-rimmed rocks. He lost his balance, fell, and brought up with a thud against a heap of broken slag. Picking himself up, he went on, only to slip and fall again. On the second fall, he landed only a few inches from the abyss of the south face, and the jolt was not only to his body but to his senses. Once more he pulled himself to his feet, but he descended no farther. To spend the night on the mountain was to die, perhaps, but to try to go on was to kill himself surely. It had been on this very ridge at night that Teo Zurbriggen, coming down from the fortress, had fallen and become a cripple for life. And on that night the rocks had not even been slippery with snow. A tremor passed through him. For several minutes he remained where he was, while the darkness thickened around him. Then slowly he worked his way back to the platform beneath the fortress. Crossing the platform, he re-entered the shallow cave. His body was bruised and aching. His head throbbed. He tried to force his mind to think, to plan, to decide what to do. But there was nothing to do, at least until morning. Nothing except to get through the night, to stay alive through the night. Fumbling in his pack, he got his extra sweater and put it on. He brought out a slice of bread and a small lump of chocolate, which was all the food he had with him. But even though he had not eaten for almost 12 hours, he had no appetite. He sat in the darkness, in the stillness. He listened. But the last sounds of the storm were gone. From his hollow in the mountainside, he looked out and down, but there was only white snow and gray rock, only the ridge falling away into space. He strained his eyes downward for a flicker of light, but there was none. The hut was hidden beneath the bulge of the ridge. Tonight it was empty, anyhow, and the valley and town of Kurtel were shut down. Sorry about that, my cat was being needy. Okay. And the valley and town of Kurtel were shut off by the intervening mass of the Dornelberg Kirtle. For the first time since early that morning, he thought of the world below, of his mother and his uncle, of his disobedience, his diffidence, his wilfulness, and the paths to which they had brought him. Far from comforting him, the image of home served only to remind him of what he had done and where he was, to fill him with such loneliness and emptiness as he had never known in his life before. He sat alone in the night, in the sky, high on the great mountain from which he might never come down. The darkness seemed to grow even thicker, the stillness even deeper. Then his head jerked up, his eyes opened. He realized that he must have slept, but for how long he didn't know. What he did know, however, instantly, was that something had changed. It was still night, but the night had changed. A thick mist had closed in. Beyond his hollow in the rocks, the night was no longer black and empty, but a ghostly gray. The world below was gone. Everything beyond the ridge, beyond the edge of the platform was gone. There were only the great banks of vapor, weaving like shrouds in the windless air. It was cold, far colder than it had been ever in the wind and snow of the storm. Shreds of mist licked his face as if with icy tongues, and a chill rose from the black rock and gripped his bones. He shifted his weight and began rubbing his hands together, and then suddenly his hands were still, as if frozen in midair. His body tensed, his eyes strained into the night, but there was only the mist. As he watched, the mist seemed to shift and thicken, to be forming itself into gray moving shapes. Night and mist, that was all there was, and at the same time, not at all. Not all, for something else was there too, something that could neither be seen nor heard, but that nevertheless existed. A part of the mountain, a part of the darkness in all that wilderness of rock and ice. Rudy knew there was no single other living thing, but he knew, too, that he was no longer alone. Where was I? Oh, there. He shivered, reaching into his pack. He brought out the one extra piece of clothing that it still contained, the old red flannel shirt. It was big enough to fit over his other clothing, and he pulled it on. Holding his arms, he held his hands tightly in the armpits and felt a slow stirring of blood in his frozen fingers. Yes, he thought, the shirt was old, but it was still warm. It might save him. His father's shirt would save him. The same shirt that he had worn 15 years before, on the Citadel, that he had taken from his own body to give to Sir Edward Stephenson. When the faint warmth vanished, his blood froze, for in that instant it came to him, the terrible knowledge, the terrible truth. The cave in which he was sitting was the one in which his father and Sir Edward Stephenson had died. He tried to leap to his feet, but couldn't move. A scream formed in his throat, but made no sound. Yes, of course it was the cave. It had to be. It was the only cave in the walls of the fortress. He should have known it all along. He sat rigid, peering around. He could almost see the two bodies lying frozen and stiff in the darkness. Staring out into the weaving mist, he knew now with cold terror what thing it was that hid behind it. He knew what the shadow had been, the invisible finger that touched him as he climbed the ridge, the thing, the presence that had whoa, followed him all that day up the desolate mountainside. The old dark legends of the Citadel rose up before him, the ghosts, the demons of the Forbidden Mountain crowding down upon him from the haunted heights. And among them, leading them, one ghost, the most terrible ghost, its face white and hollow, ice sheath- sheathing its sightless eyes. A ghost with a red shirt, moving gaunt and frozen through the mist. Rudy crouched motionless in an instant. The scream would burst from his lips in an instant. He would leap up and run, racing wildly from the cave, across the platform, down the ridge, stumbling, falling, plunging over the rocks, over the cliffs, into the abyss, anywhere so long as it was from this accursed place, in an instant now. But the instant did not come. Still he crouched unmoving, still he crouched in silence, while the horror moved toward him, out of the night and the mist, while the white face flickered, and the dead eyes gleamed, and the shirt hung from its bones like a bloody shroud. And when at last a sound came from his lips, it was not a scream, but only a whisper. Father? Father? Then the strange thing happened, the incredible and wonderful thing. His heart was suddenly calm. His fear had vanished, and with it the spectre vanished. There was only the mist and the night of himself, alone in the night, and he thought, yes, of course, that is all it is. My father who died here, who died proud and unafraid, who gave the shirt from his back to a man whose need was greater, as he had now given it to me. He looked down at the shirt that covered him, and his body beneath it seemed no longer cold, but almost warm. He looked out past the walls of the cave, and the mist and darkness were still there, but the evil was gone from them. I am not afraid either, he thought. My father is not here to harm me, but to watch over me, to make me the guide that he was, the man that he was, my father. Art, who art in heaven, hallowed by thy name. He prayed, then he slept in his father's shirt, in his father's cave, on his father's mountain. At the first light he awoke and rose. Crossing the platform he peered down along the ridge, and though it was still covered with snow and mist still filled the air, he could at least see the form and pattern of the rocks. For a moment, turning, he looked up at the fortress and the grey nothingness above it. Then he began the descent of the ridge. He moved slowly, testing each hold and stance before he used it, and scraping the snow away carefully with his hands and feet, but even so he slipped constantly. His body felt drained and strengthless, and his arms and legs were like bars of lead. He stumbled, slipped, caught himself, moved on, and slipped again. Soon the slip would come. He thought dully, when he would not catch himself, when he would fall, as old Theo had fallen, plunging and twisting through space. No, he had stopped. He kicked his numb feet against the rock. He held his hands under the red shirt, until again he felt the stirring of blood. He looked down into the mist, up into the mist, and beyond it. At last the sky was brightening. No, he would not fall. He would not fall. As he moved down again, his lips were tight and grim. He was Rudy Matt, the son of Joseph Matt, and he would make it. He would make it. And that is the end of chapter 12 of Banner in the Sky. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you later.